With me is Professor Theo Venter from the Business School at Northwest University in South Africa, joining us again. Hi, Professor Venter.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's been a very eventful week after that White House powwow between President Cyril Ramaphosa and President Trump. But the message that's sort of reverberating around the world now, and especially being picked up by right-wing politicians in the parliament, like in Belgium, is that video of Julius Malema. So does this give wind in his sails?
Yeah, that is one of the interesting things, and it reminds me of approximately a year ago when we had an election in South Africa, and usually after the election, everything is sorted out, and you go on with your life. In our case, we had a government of national unity, and it kept going for a month before we had any clarity about where things are going. It seems to me the White House meeting had a similar kind of fallout, way beyond what we thought it would be. But let's start with Malema. The difficulty with Malema and his well-known killer farmer, killer Boer kind of rhetoric is that if you focus on it, you provide him the oxygen that he needs. And the oxygen that he needs, of course, is exposure. And when that video was played in the White House, I was immediately of the view that, okay, Malema is going to convert this into a big win. He's going to convert this into another form of publication or publicity, which is very similar to what Donald Trump did with his one or two court cases. And he effectively converted that into political support. Now, Julius Malema does exactly the same. His life in politics is about these kind of things. And I knew he's going to exploit it. Not only did he exploit that over the weekend by doing it over and over and over again, because now the world has taken note of it and it's becoming very difficult. And the timid reply by our president on it, by not categorically saying this is not on. I think that is the tension that we're currently feeling. If I can just remind the listeners, when it was shown in the White House, the president's response was, firstly, it is constitutionally allowed, you've got freedom of speech. Secondly, it was taken to the highest court in the land, and the highest court in the land determined that it is not hate speech. So when he does it, he's within the bounds of law. Now, that was not a very satisfactory answer to the Donald Trump show, but that is the case. And I think the question that we must ask ourselves in South Africa is why can we not and why should we not um, act on these issues, or what are the limitations of Ramaphosa to be a little bit more categoric in his criticism of this kind of slant? Because you're quite right, it's being picked up globally in several quarters, and it's kind of dominating the political scene from outside in.
Well, if you look at the Belgian parliament, and one of these politicians asked, but, if you say kill the Zulus, that would overnight have such repercussions. Everybody's asking, why is Malema getting away with this?
Okay, let me start from the beginning. When AfriForum, one of the right-wing lobby groups in South Africa, when they took the killer farmer, killer Boer to court to determine or to kind of make a case that it is hate speech, and they lost in the Constitutional Court, what they actually did, they created a legal framework for it to take place. So by losing the case, they made it almost possible to use it anywhere and at any place. So there was this contradictory kind of outcome. You wanted to determine that that is hate speech, and through all the court procedures and things, it was determined that no, this song emerged from the struggle. There's a political heritage to it. Um, it may be morally wrong, but it is legally okay. So we have now the struggle in South Africa between the two terms, legality on the one hand and legitimacy on the other hand. Legitimacy has to do with the morality of what you're doing. Is it good or bad? Not whether it's legal. It's like a stop street. To stop at a stop street, that's the legal position. To drive over a stop street by not stopping if nobody's looking, it's a moral question. So what AfriForum did, they took the case to court and they took the morality argument out of the deal by making it legal. And now we're sitting with it. Now we get to the state president. He's leader of the ANC, but he's also leader of the country as the state president. The ANC's position is that they do not use the song anymore. They do not subscribe to it. They don't think it's a good thing. Very, very politically correct. And it was echoed by Thabo Mbeki 2 weeks ago. And so what Cyril did in the White House and what he did in Parliament a day or two ago was to follow the ANC line, while people would expect him to be a little bit more categoric, saying it's not on. If you want to establish a South African state where there's a new culture called a South Africanism, and not a Zulu ethnic or an Afrikaner ethnic enclave or whatever, then this song is detrimental to that process. And I think we are now continuing on a slippery slope where the president keeps to the ANC's position, where the right-wing groups are lobbying harder and harder, and their networks all over the world are putting it up. But I think Ramaphosa is limited by what the ANC can allow him to do in light of political changes that are coming, new leadership elections next year and the year after that, and different factions in the party. So he's a little bit of a lame duck in terms of killer farmer, killer Boer.
Well, can we look at Malema? His support was draining. I mean, he lost a lot of support to the MK party of Jacob Zuma. So, what do you think this would have on in the next election, how well he does among the left wing of South Africa?
Yeah, before the election a year ago, some survey research indicated that Malema can get up to 17% of the vote. Then MK emerged, and his support dropped from 11 to 12% to just over 9%. So yeah, it's a 3 percentage point drop in support. I think the MK party in Parliament is overshadowing the EFF. So the only mechanism the EFF has, because it's now the fourth biggest party and not the third anymore, is to up the amount of publicity it gets, to get larger audiences. I was fascinated by Trump. I know in his campaign he was counting people. The size of the audience was a determination of the kind of support you got. And when he saw 100,000 people in a stadium in South Africa, he was impressed by that. What we didn't tell him, or his people didn't tell him, is that if you have 100,000 people in a stadium in America, they probably all drove there. When you've got 100,000 people in South Africa, they were taken there by buses, by trains, through massive mobilization all over the country. It's not as if it's people from one area that goes there. It's a massive project. So, but being as it may, we will see the EFF again performing in the local government elections next year. In the by-elections so far, MK party did far better than we thought, and not the EFF. So the EFF is losing out, especially in local government, where we have a proportion of the vote being first past the post. So in first past the post, very often your smaller parties totally disappear because of the way in which the vote is counted. And in Great Britain, you've got a very similar position where Farage claims a lot of support, but when the election takes place, first past the post, the number of seats is in no way near what he claims his support is. But that's a result of the political system. If you had proportional representation in Great Britain, I'm not even sure Keith Starmer would be the premier, but that's another story and another argument. Back to Malema. The trajectory of his support is downward. It's not upward. And therefore, we can expect him as a enigma in politics in South Africa to up the ante through his actions in Parliament, through his actions on TV, and through his actions to get the kind of exposure. And you get the exposure in the media if you say things that attacks the media. That he understands that very well. And the cameramen and the journalists flock to the meetings, waiting for something that Malema will say that is in newspapers immediately and the next day.
But does he have a target on his back now where the West is concerned? Because there's already this movement in the US to start sanctioning some members of the ANC. Do you think that Malema would most definitely be on the list?
Yeah, it would be on the list. And that legislation is now in the House, where it nominates the ANC specifically. And I think in the debates and in the hearings, I think it will be expanded to talk about leaders that fosters hate speech or things like that. I think the reference to the ANC as the culprit would probably be widened to include people like Julius Malema, even Jacob Zuma.
Well, Malema already seems to be having problems going overseas. Wasn't there a problem with him going to speak at Cambridge University?
The British government promised to give Malema a visa and told him that he can get the visa just before he leaves on our Tambo, our international airport in Johannesburg. And by the time he got to the airport, some administrative problem emerged. Now, that is a very nice way of saying that we're not going to allow you. Somewhere, some administrative mistake ended in. And that is exactly what's going to happen to any of the South African leaders that will be sanctioned. Your travel not only to the US, but to all nations that subscribe to this bigger network will be limited. Using your credit card would be limited. Transferring money would be curtailed. So there's a lot of things, and we know that because we know that's what happened to Russian leaders and other leaders that were sanctioned. It is a very, very hard and a difficult choice. It isolates you. It even isolated somebody like Putin that can only visit a few countries that do not subscribe to this limitation.
Well, can we look at the meeting of Trump and Ramaphosa and what has really came out of it? Well, first of all, there was that change. It has been said to appease Elon Musk with regard to Starlink. What else can we expect now? I mean, because the clock is ticking for that 30% tariff.
Starlink was on the agenda, but not the major issue. I know it took a lot of attention. And if we look at Musk, it seems to me his relationship with the White House is cooling. It's not as strong as it was 2 or 3 months ago. I think the big takeaway is that, firstly, the door is open of the White House. Secondly, it was obvious that Msebenzi Jonas should have been there as our newly appointed envoy. We don't have an ambassador, but he was in England apparently for other business. I don't really buy that story because I think the Americans also listened to that one speech he had about his view on Trump. So keeping him out of the meeting meant that one less problem to be confronted with. But I think the big story is that the meeting was supposed to be a lunch and then a press conference. So because of problems Trump had to deal with in the Congress to get his big beautiful bill through, and that meeting was turned around. So first we had a press conference, and then we had the behind closed doors discussion. Apparently, behind closed doors, the feeling was far more relaxed and far more businesslike. And out of that, at least three things are now emerging. One is that we are looking at our BEE application for foreign investors, not only Musk, but I think Musk is the first to benefit from that. Secondly, it seems to me we have made a kind of arrangement which still must be formalized that South Africa will buy its LPG, its natural gas, from America because our sources of natural gas are running low in Mozambique. And the new gas fields can't be developed due to that unrest in the northern parts of Mozambique. So the Americans are coming in not only with ships full of LPG, but also with technology on fracking and a few other things. We've got well established sources of gas, but we haven't done any fracking. So we're looking into that. And then the interesting thing is, in exchange for gas, which we will buy from the US will then take in Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Ford products being manufactured in South Africa at a zero rate. That is the current talks. So it's gas for cars, which means the trading of cars or motor vehicles in general is taken out of the AGOA agreement and linked to another bilateral agreement. So what I must also say, it seems to me we must accept AGOA as a has been. It's still on the books, but it has been. The third thing which is emerging is that we are now negotiating with the Americans to have a seasonal tariff. That means when it is summer in South Africa, we can export fruits that's available to the Americans when they have winter. When it is winter in South Africa, those things will be tariffed at a certain level going to the US. So it gives some kind of a leeway, but not a 30% tariff. And just a reminder on this tariff thing. 2 or 3 days ago, Trump announced that Europe will now get a 50% tariff because they're not playing ball. And then a day after that, he said, okay, I'm going to drop it until the 9th of July, which is, of course, the final date for everybody, including South Africa. And then the next day, he had a press conference yesterday, and one of the journalists said to him, sir, how do you feel about this TACO approach? So TACO is the abbreviation for Trump always comes back to, he puts up a story, and then 2 or 3 days, he changes it. And Trump was so annoyed by that journalist. Well, he didn't call the journalist an idiot like he did on the South African case, but he said, after he explained, suddenly I could see in his body language, he's fed up now. And he then turned to the journalist saying, that's the nastiest, typical American, nastiest, not nasty, nastiest question I ever had. Then he continued. Then he took another question, and then he returned to the nasty question. He referred to that question 4 times. So anybody calls him a chicken, that Trump and chicken doesn't go along. He was very much annoyed by that kind of thing. And then on the same day, one of the federal courts that has got authority and that looks at international trade said to Trump, sorry, sir, but these tariffs that you have announced is unconstitutional. The tariffs are really determined by Congress and not by the president. So you are beyond what you can do. And they mentioned 4 countries, Mexico, Canada, China, really 3 countries. And they said those tariffs are not on. So And the White House has appealed that immediately, but I think there's a little bit of pushback to this tariff war. And I saw a very nice one-liner on this thing about tariffs, chicken, and Trump. Somebody said, tariffs by tantrum. So if you throw a tantrum, you announce a tariff. And I think Trump has overused the tariff regime, and the amount of pushback now will bring the world back to some form of normality. And I think the South African case, where we started, will not be a 31% tariff. I think it will be far more diverse, and in some cases it will be zero, and in some cases it will be an exchange, like gas for cars. But I think, yes, there will be a bilateral agreement, and it will be influenced by Trump's political perspective about South Africa, because the tariffs to us is one part of the problem. The second part of the problem is, will he come to the G20 summit in November? And if he comes to the G20 summit, it will be a major victory for Ramaphosa. But if he's not coming, I think that the glitter of the G20 will just disappear.
Well, he's indicated apparently that he will be coming.
That's my understanding as well. But he indicated it in a very ambiguous way. You're not exactly sure. He hasn't he's as ambiguous about the G20 summit as Ramaphosa is ambiguous about killer farmer, killer Boer.
So do you think there'd be a resolution or an agreement, bilateral agreements on these measures that you were talking about by the 9th of July?
I think so. I think people are working very hard behind the scenes. My information is that they've got regular meetings daily, 2-3 times a week, with the American representatives, working out a deal, and it will include agriculture. Because the big question was, AGOA can be managed, but there's one area that is specifically vulnerable, and that is the Western Cape, which is, of course, an area in South Africa that receives winter rainfall. That is a major part of the country with grapes. That is major in citrus. But there are other parts of the country that also produces that, but not at the scale and at the time than where it's ready in the Western Cape. So the Western Cape, I'm not exactly sure whether we have a deal that's going to fit their specific profile.
So the seasonal agreement might not work for the Western Cape or for citrus fruit that ripens in the winter.
And that's currently how it looks.
Professor Theo Venter, thanks so much.
My pleasure, like always.